The Greyhound bus rumbled through the Georgia night, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights over a battlefield. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of an unspoken truth that hung over America, like a storm cloud that refused to break. In the back row, pressed against the window where the heater didn't quite reach, sat a man who had seen things that would make most people's nightmares seem like children's stories. His name was James William Crawford, and pinned to his chest, though you couldn't see it beneath his worn army jacket, was a bronze star with a V for valor. But on that bus in February 1951, heading home from the hell of Korea, that medal meant nothing at all. This is the story of a man who risked everything for a country that wouldn't even let him sit down. James Crawford was born in 1928 in a sharecropper's shack outside Macon, Georgia, where the cotton fields stretched to the horizon like an ocean of white that his family would drown in year after year. His father, Samuel, had picked cotton since he was 5 years old. His mother, Ruth, had hands so callous from washing white people's clothes that she couldn't feel hot water anymore. They had 3 children, and James was the youngest, a quiet boy with eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. The South in those days was a different world, or maybe it was the same world it had always been, just wearing a new mask. The war, the big one, World War II, had ended just a few years earlier. Black men had gone overseas and fought fascism in Europe, had stormed beaches and liberated concentration camps, had bled and died for freedom. Then they came home to a country where they couldn't drink from the same water fountain as the men they'd fought beside, where they couldn't vote without passing impossible tests or paying poll taxes they couldn't afford, where a white woman's accusation could get you lynched and nobody would ever face justice for it. James grew up knowing these rules the way other children learned their multiplication tables. Don't look a white man in the eye, step off the sidewalk when white folks pass. Yes sir, no sir, thank you sir, even when they're calling you boy and you're 30 years old. His father had taught him, keep your head down, James. Keep your head down and maybe you'll live long enough to see things change. But James had read about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. He'd heard whispers about a young preacher in Montgomery named King who was talking about dignity and rights. And somewhere deep inside, in a place he didn't talk about, James wondered if keeping your head down was the same as losing your soul. In 1950, when he was 22 years old, James did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He enlisted in the Army. Not because he was drafted, that would come later for many young men. He volunteered. His mother cried for 3 days straight. His father sat him down and asked him if he'd lost his mind. Boy, Samuel said, what do you think is going to be different in that army than it is here? You think they're going to treat you like a man just because you put on a uniform? But James had his reasons. The Army meant steady pay. It meant 3 meals a day. It meant getting out of Georgia, even if it was just for a little while. And maybe, just maybe, it meant proving something. Not to white folks, but to himself. That he was worth more than picking cotton until his back gave out. That he could be something other than what this country had decided he should be. If you're finding yourself drawn into James's story, hit that subscribe button. What happens next will change everything he thought he knew about courage, about country, and about what a man is willing to die for. And let me know in the comments, did you know about the segregated buses that greeted returning Korean War veterans? Basic training at Fort Benning was exactly what his father had warned him about. The barracks were segregated. The mess halls had separate sections. The white drill sergeants called them boys, and worse. And if you complained, you'd find yourself on latrine duty for a month. But James kept his head down and did what he was told. He could shoot straight years of hunting rabbits and squirrels in the Georgia woods had given him. Steady hands and a good eye. He could march all day without complaining. And when the orders came down that he was shipping out to Korea with the 24th Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit, he packed his duffel bag and tried not to think about what his mother's face had looked like when he'd left. Korea was hell on earth. Not the hell of fire and brimstone, but a cold hell, a frozen hell where your rifle jammed because the oil in the chamber turned to ice, where men lost fingers and toes to frostbite, where the Chinese came across the Yalu River in waves so thick you couldn't see the ground beneath them. The 24th Infantry was thrown into the meat grinder at the Pusan perimeter, then at Kunari, fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1, with equipment that should have been replaced after World War II, under the command of white officers who sometimes seemed more concerned with whether the black soldiers under them were combat effective than with keeping them alive. It was at Chipyong-ni in February 1951 that James Crawford became a different man. His company was dug in on a ridge surrounded on 3 sides by Chinese forces. They'd been holding the position for 2 days without reinforcements, running low on ammunition, watching their numbers shrink with each wave of attacks. The captain, a white man from Virginia who'd at least had the decency to learn his men's names, had been hit by mortar fire. The lieutenant was dead. The sergeant had taken command, and he was a man James respected, Sergeant Morris Jackson. from Detroit, who'd fought in World War II and had told them stories about the liberation of Dachau that made even the hardest men cry. The Chinese attacked at dawn when the sky was just turning from black to gray and every man's hands were numb from cold. They came up the ridge screaming, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. In that moment, it was impossible to count. James was in a foxhole with a kid from Alabama named Tommy Briggs, who was 19 years old and had been writing letters to a girl back home named Sarah, who he was going to marry as soon as he got back. Tommy's hands were shaking so bad he couldn't load his rifle. "We're going to die here," Tommy kept saying. "We're going to die here, and nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to even know." James grabbed him by the collar. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was steady, even though inside he felt like he was falling off a cliff. "You ain't dying today. You're going home to Sarah. You hear me?" Then the Chinese were on them. James fired until his rifle was so hot it burned his hands through his gloves. He threw grenades. He fixed his bayonet and fought hand-to-hand when they got into the foxhole. And there was a moment, just a split second, when he looked into the eyes of a Chinese soldier who couldn't have been older than 17, and he saw his own fear reflected back at him. Then it was over and the soldier was dead and James was covered in blood that wasn't his own. The attack was beaten back, but barely. When the sun finally came up all the way, James looked around and counted 12 men left in his platoon. There had been 42 that morning. Sergeant Jackson was dead. Tommy Briggs was dead, had taken a bullet to the head in the last minutes of the fight, and James wondered if Sarah back in Alabama knew yet that she'd be wearing black instead of white. Take a moment to hit that like button if this story is affecting you. What James did next would earn him a Bronze Star and reveal the bitter truth about the Americas he was fighting for. A captain from another company came up to survey the damage and found James sitting on the edge of the foxhole, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, his eyes empty. The captain read the scene, the bodies of Chinese soldiers all around. The defensive position held, the few surviving men looking at James like he was something more than human. "What's your name, soldier?" the captain asked. "Private James Crawford, sir." "Well, Private Crawford, looks like you held this position damn near by yourself. I'm putting you in for a commendation." James just nodded. The Bronze Star with V device would arrive 6 weeks later, pinned on his chest by a colonel who shook his hand for exactly 3 seconds and then moved on to the next man. It was the same day James got his orders to rotate back to the States. He'd done his 13 months, he'd survived, he was going home. The trip back was a blur. A transport ship from Incheon to San Francisco, where he set foot on American soil after more than a year away and felt nothing, no relief, no joy, just a hollow numbness that scared him more than the Chinese attacks had. A train across the country watching America pass by his window, the mountains, the plains, the small towns where people waved at the trains even though they couldn't see who was inside, and finally another train to Georgia, to Atlanta, where he'd catch a Greyhound bus for the last leg home to Macon. He was tired. God, he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He wanted to see his mother's face. He wanted to eat her cooking. He wanted to sleep in a bed that didn't rock with the ocean or freeze him solid, or sit in a place where someone might be trying to kill him. Was that too much to ask? After everything? After holding that ridge? After watching Tommy Briggs die with a picture of Sarah in his pocket? The Greyhound station in Atlanta was crowded, full of people heading home after work or visiting family or starting journeys to places James could only imagine. He bought his ticket Macon, Georgia, one way and stood in line to board. His duffel bag was slung over his shoulder. He was still wearing his army uniform because it was the only decent set of clothes he had. The Bronze Star was in his pocket. He'd taken it off because wearing it made people stare, and he'd had enough of people staring. When he got to the front of the line, the bus driver, a heavy-set white man with small eyes and a face like weathered leather, looked him up and down. Then he pointed to the back of the bus. "Colorades in the rear," he said, like he was reading from a menu. James stood there for a moment. Just a moment. In Korea, he'd shared foxholes with white soldiers. He'd fought beside them, bled beside them. A white medic from Iowa had bandaged his leg when he'd taken shrapnel. A white corporal from Texas had split his last cigarette with him during a lull in the fighting. But that was Korea. This was Georgia. And in Georgia, nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. He walked to the back of the bus. The back was already crowded with other black passengers. A woman with 2 small children who looked exhausted beyond measure. An old man in overalls who might have been a farmer or a laborer. A young couple dressed in their Sunday best. James found a seat by the window in the very last row. The seat was torn and the stuffing was coming out. The heater didn't work back here and his breath fogged in front of his face. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. The bus filled up. Every seat in the white section taken. Then more white passengers got on. A white woman with shopping bags. A businessman with a briefcase. A teenage boy eating a sandwich. And when there were no more seats in the white section, the bus driver stood up. "Y'all in the back," he called out. "Need 3 of you to stand up. We got passengers need to sit." The words hit James like a physical blow. He opened his eyes and stared at the back of the seat in front of him, at the graffiti someone had carved their initials in a heart. Like love was something that could survive in a world like this. The woman with the children stood up first, gathering her kids, murmuring to them to be quiet. The old man stood up slowly, his joints clearly paining him. The bus driver was still looking back, his eyes scanning the remaining passengers. "You too, soldier boy," he said, pointing at James. "On your feet. We got folks need to sit." Something inside James broke then. Not broke like shattering, broke like a dam giving way, like all the pressure that had been building for 23 years suddenly finding a crack to pour through. He'd kept his head down his whole life. He'd said yes sir and no sir. He'd picked cotton in the burning sun. He'd stood at attention while white drill sergeants called him boy. He'd fought in Korea. He'd held that ridge at Chipyong-ni while men died around him. He'd killed Chinese soldiers who'd probably been drafted same as him, who'd probably had mothers worrying about them back home same as his. He'd bled for this country. And now this country, his country, the one he'd risked everything for, was telling him he wasn't good enough to sit down on a bus. "No," James said. The bus went silent. Every head turned to look at him. The bus driver's face turned red, then purple. "What did you say?" James stood up, but not to give up his seat. He stood up to face the man. "I said no. I just spent 13 months in Korea fighting for this country. I earned the right to sit down. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is a moment that captures everything wrong with America in 1951 and shows the courage it took just to exist." The bus driver came down the aisle, his hands balled into fists. Other white passengers were standing up now. Men mostly, their faces hard. James could see how this was going to go. He was going to get beaten, maybe arrested. He might even die. Black men had been killed for less than refusing to give up a bus seat. He thought about Tommy Briggs dying on that frozen ridge in Korea. He thought about Sergeant Jackson. He thought about all the men who'd never come home. "Boy," the bus driver said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've got about 5 seconds to get off this bus before I have you arrested." "We don't allow troublemakers here. I ain't making trouble," James said. "I just want to go home." "Then you should, thought about that before you forgot your place." That word place. Like James was a thing to be arranged, a piece of furniture to be moved around. He felt the weight of his bronze star in his pocket, that small piece of metal that was supposed to mean something. He pulled it out and held it up. "You see this? This is a bronze star. I got it for holding a position against Chinese forces at Chipyong-ni. Men died that day. Good men. And I came home because I actually believed that I was fighting for something that mattered. But you know what? I was wrong. Because here I am, and you're telling me I can't sit down because of the color of my skin." The bus driver snatched the medal from James's hand and looked at it like it was a piece of trash. Then he dropped it on the floor. "I don't care if you got 100 medals. Rules is rules. Now get off this bus." James looked down at his bronze star lying on the dirty floor of the bus, covered in mud and cigarette ash. He looked at the white passengers staring at him with a mixture of anger, disgust, and something that might have been shame but probably wasn't. He looked at the other black passengers in the back, their eyes telling him to just comply, to not make it worse, to survive this like they'd survived everything else. And James realized something in that moment, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The war hadn't been in Korea. The war was here. It had always been here. And it wasn't over. It would never be over until people stood up and said no. Until people were willing to sacrifice something for the truth that all men are created equal, even though America had never really believed that, had never really meant it when it was written down on that piece of paper that white kids learned about in school. But James was tired. He was so tired. And he was one man on a bus full of people who wanted him gone. So he bent down, picked up his bronze star, and walked off the bus. He stood in the parking lot of the Greyhound station in Atlanta, Georgia, in February 1951, watching the bus pull away with empty seats in the back that he wasn't allowed to sit in. And he cried. For the first time since Korea, James Crawford cried. He would eventually make it home to Macon. He would eventually see his mother's face and eat her cooking, and sleep in his childhood bed. But something had changed. Something had broken and couldn't be put back together. Because James had learned what so many other black veterans learned in those years after the war. That the uniform didn't protect you. That sacrifice didn't earn you respect. That you could fight for your country, could bleed for it, could watch your friends die for it, and still be told to stand up so a white person could sit down. Leave a comment and tell me how would you have reacted in James's position. And make sure you're subscribed because the story of what happened to black Korean War veterans gets even more painful. James Crawford's story wasn't unique. It was the story of thousands of black soldiers who came home from Korea to face the same segregation, the same discrimination, the same casual cruelty that they'd left behind. They'd fought in integrated units for the first time. President Truman had desegregated the military in 1948, but that integration ended the moment they stepped off the transport ships and back onto American soil. Suddenly they were colored again, Negro again, boy again. All the ranks and medals and service records meant nothing compared to the color of their skin. In Mississippi, a black veteran named Isaac Woodard had his eyes gouged out by police for talking back to a bus driver, and the police officer was acquitted. In Louisiana, another veteran named John Jones was lynched for wearing his uniform too proudly. In Georgia, in Alabama, and South Carolina, and states across the South, and sometimes even in the North, black veterans were beaten, arrested, killed for the crime of thinking that their service had earned them something. Dignity, respect, basic human rights. The bus incident haunted James for years. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, heart pounding, and it wouldn't be the Chinese soldiers he was seeing. It would be that bus driver's face, that look of contempt, that bronze star lying on the dirty floor. He started attending NACA meetings in Macon. He heard about a woman named Rosa Parks in Montgomery who would, in 1955, refuse to give up her seat on a bus and spark a movement that would change the country. When he heard that story, James cried again, but this time it was different. This time it was because he understood that his moment on that bus in 1951 had mattered. That every small act of resistance mattered, that every time someone said no to injustice, they were chipping away at the foundation of a system that had stood for hundreds of years. James never went back to the army. He got a job at a garage in Macon, fixing cars, working with his hands. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy, and they had 3 children. He told them stories about Korea sometimes, about the friends he'd made and lost, about the cold and the fear and the strange sense of brotherhood that existed in combat. But he always ended those stories the same way. I fought for this country. And when I came home, this country told me I wasn't good enough to sit down on a bus. Don't you ever forget that, and don't you ever accept it. His oldest son, Michael, would join the Freedom Riders in 1961, would ride buses through the South to challenge segregation, would be beaten in Alabama and arrested in Mississippi. When James visited him in jail, Michael said, "Dad, I'm doing what you couldn't do on that bus in Atlanta. I'm saying no, and I'm not walking away." James gripped his son's hand through the bars. "I walked away because I didn't think I could win, but you're winning. You're all winning. You're changing this country. If this story is moving you, hit that like button and leave a comment about the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, the veterans who fought 2 wars, one overseas and one at home. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would finally outlaw segregation in public places. James was 36 years old when it passed, and he drove to Atlanta with Dorothy and the kids to ride that same Greyhound route from Atlanta to Macon. He sat in the front of the bus. The white passengers didn't look happy about it, but they didn't say anything. Times had changed. Or were changing. Slowly. Too slowly. But changing. James Crawford died in 2003 at the age of 75. His Bronze Star was buried with him, along with his dog tags and a photograph of Sergeant Morris Jackson at his funeral. His children and grandchildren told stories about a man who'd shown them what courage really meant. Not the courage to fight in a war, but the courage to stand up for yourself when your own country told you to sit down, or stand up, or move, or know your place. In 2005, the Army began a project to document the stories of Korean War veterans before they were lost to time. One of those stories was James William Crawford's, a young historian interviewing other members of the 24th Infantry found James's name in after-action reports from Chipyong-ni, found mention of his Bronze Star, found testimony from survivors who remembered the soldier who'd held the line when everything was falling apart. That historian tried to track down James, but found only his obituary. She spoke with his widow, Dorothy, who was 80 years old and still teaching Sunday school at the AIM Church in Macon. Dorothy told her about the bus incident, about how James had carried that moment with him for 50 years, about how it had defined him in ways that even war hadn't. He used to say, Dorothy told the historian, that he didn't regret serving his country. He regretted that his country didn't serve him back. But he also said that his children lived in a better world because people had fought for it. Not fought with guns, fought with courage and words, and by refusing to accept things the way they were. The historian included James's story in a book published in 2007 about Black Korean War veterans. Most people never read it. Most people still don't know the names of the men who fought in Korea, who held the line against Chinese forces in the frozen mountains, who came home to a country that thanked them with segregation and discrimination and violence. But their children know, their grandchildren know, and now you know. Make sure you subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like James's stories that history forgot but that we need to remember. Drop a comment about how this story changed your perspective on the Korean War and the Civil Rights Movement. The story of James Crawford is the story of America's greatest shame and its greatest hope. The shame of a country that could send black men to die for freedom while denying them basic dignity at home. The hope of a country that could change, that did change. Because people like James and his son Michael and Rosa Parks and Martin, Luther King Jr., and thousands of nameless others decided that enough was enough. On that bus in 1951, James Crawford made a choice. He said no. And even though he eventually walked away, even though he got off that bus, that moment of resistance mattered. It mattered because it was true. It mattered because he was right. It mattered because every single time someone stands up against injustice, even if they don't win, even if they walk away, they're changing the world. They're planting a seed that will grow into something bigger than they can imagine. Today, you can ride a bus anywhere in America and sit wherever you want, regardless of your skin color. That seems like such a small thing, such a basic right, but it wasn't always that way. It took people fighting, bleeding, dying to make it that way. It took people like James Crawford, who risked his life in Korea and then came home to fight another war. A war against a system that told him he was less than human. The bronze star that was dropped on the floor of that bus, that was picked up and carried home and eventually buried with James Crawford, that medal represented more than military valor. It represented the contradiction at the heart of America, a country founded on the principle that all men are created equal, a country that has spent most of its history denying that principle, and a country that has slowly, painfully, imperfectly moved toward making that principle real. James Crawford never became famous. He never led marches or gave speeches or had his picture in the newspaper. He fixed cars in Macon, Georgia. He raised 3 children. He loved his wife. He went to church. He told his grandchildren stories about Korea and about the bus, making sure they understood both the horror and the hope, the shame and the progress. But his story, the story of a soldier who fought for his country and was denied a seat on it, is a story that needs to be told, because it reminds us that freedom isn't free, and not just in the way that phrase is usually meant. Freedom isn't free because people have to fight for it, not just on battlefields overseas, but in bus stations and lunch counters and voting booths at home. Freedom isn't free because the price of maintaining it is eternal vigilance against those who would take it away, who would divide people by race or religion or any other category designed to separate us into those who matter and those who don't. When James Crawford died, his family found a letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to the bus driver from that day in 1951, though James hadn't known his name. The letter was dated 1965, right after the Voting Rights Act passed. It said, "I don't know if you're still alive or if you ever think about that day in Atlanta when you made me get off your bus. I think about it every day. I used to hate you for it. I used to dream about going back and making you understand what you'd done, making you see me as a human being instead of a problem to be moved to the back of the bus, but I don't hate you anymore. I pity you. Because you lived your whole life thinking you were better than someone else because of the color of your skin. You lived your whole life small and mean and afraid. And I lived my life knowing that I was part of something big, movement toward justice, toward equality, toward the America that we were always supposed to be but never quite reached. I'm not better than you, but I was right and you were wrong. And history will remember that, even if it forgets both our names. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to James Crawford's story. Hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss more stories about the forgotten heroes of American history. And please, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. These stories matter. These voices matter, and the only way we move forward is by understanding where we've been. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, but the men who fought in it weren't forgotten by their families. They weren't forgotten by the people whose lives they touched, and they shouldn't be forgotten by us. Men like James Crawford, black soldiers who fought for a country that didn't fully accept them, who came home to face discrimination and segregation, who nonetheless persevered and helped build the movement that would finally bring America closer to its founding ideals. These men are heroes in the truest sense of the word. They didn't just fight the enemy overseas. They fought the enemy at home. Racism, injustice, inequality. They fought it with courage and dignity, and by refusing to accept the world as it was. They fought it by raising children who would continue the fight. They fought it by living lives that proved every single day that the color of your skin has nothing to do with the content of your character. James Crawford held a ridge in Korea against overwhelming odds. But the real battle of his life was fought on that bus in Atlanta, in that moment when he had to decide whether to stand up for himself or accept the injustice. He stood up. And even though he walked away, even though he didn't win that particular battle, he was part of winning the war, the long war, the war that's still being fought today. Because freedom is never finally, it has to be defended and renewed by each generation. So remember James Crawford? Remember the soldier who fought 2 wars? Remember the man who was denied a seat on a bus after risking his life for his country? Remember him not just as a victim of injustice, but as a symbol of resistance. As proof that one person saying no, one person standing up, one person refusing to accept the unacceptable, that it matters, that it changes things, that it's how we move forward. And remember that the fight isn't over. There are still battles to be fought for equality, for justice, for the idea that all of us, regardless of race, religion, gender, or any other category, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. James Crawford fought those battles. His son fought them. His grandchildren are fighting them today. The question is, will you? Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and building a better future. And that starts with remembering stories like James Crawford's. I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more forgotten stories that shape the America we live in today.